Good morning, good afternoon or good evening. This is a video for Year 13 sitting their component exam, their written exam, and this specific video is about section A, which is the arguing against with the statement for the theatre statement in relation to a production that you saw. Okay, so if you haven't already, this is connected to my video on my as-rake structure, which you can see a little bit about on there. However, just as a recap, we have the elements of as-rake, which we know is going to be our checklist, not necessarily has to happen in the order. But here is a quick reminder: we've got elements that have to be in each paragraph. We must address the statement in one way, shape or form, either agreeing or disagreeing. It's generally this question and this response should be a writing to argue in some respect. You have to pick out specific moments from the production, not the play, the production that you saw. You should use a range of dramatic elements or theatre/theatre makers, i.e. over the breadth of the essay. Once all the paragraphs are kind of put together, you shouldn't just have focused, say, on acting. You could focus on design elements as well. Equally, if you are focusing on design, it shouldn't just be one design area, it should be a numerous amount, and focus on those theatre makers using their names ideally. You must really have analysis throughout, in terms of the intention of what the choices they made were. You should be using key terms, and you should evaluate thoroughly throughout. So that is just a quick recap, because realistically you should have seen my other video in terms of what my as-rake structure looks like, which this is the back end of. Okay, so I'm going to give you in this a couple of examples. The first one I'm going to lead you into a bit more, but then I'm going to do one a bit more live, and then I'm going to hand a bit of a task over to you. So this is an example of a potential question which I reckon is kind of in the same vein of what could potentially come up. I'm not making any predictions, I'm not associated, but this is a possible example. So they generally have these really broad statements such as theatre makers today rely too much on technology to impress an audience. So in the rest of this video I'm going to guide you as to how I would expect my students to plan in order to support themselves and make sure that they keep on track of what this question wants. Alright, so I'm going to guide you through on this one a little bit more and go through, just say out loud how I would tackle something like this if it came up, because you do get a choice, but this is how I would do it. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to go to that bubble there, because I'm just going to say out loud what my thought process would be if I was faced with this question. So I'm focusing on sort of key area there of technology, because that's the kind of key to this question, and that's where the debate should be around. So my first thought process would be, okay, so by technology I connect that to meaning anything that's not really actor based, so elements, so possibly things like special effects if your production had it, but it might include some sort of counterbalance though if actually you did talk about the actor. So let me just expand that. Okay, whilst it's leading you to talk about technology, as part of your argument you could actually say that the acting elements within this were the impressive or more so impressive. So that could give you something in terms of an angle, so you don't just stay on that one theatre area and one theatre element, which as we know is crucial in order to get a range of theatre makers. So that's just a little bit of a, if you get a question like that, think, outside the box as well. Don't necessarily think about it as you have to solely talk about that. It might help you in terms of talking about your breadth of argument. Okay, so realistically, okay, I tell my students that I would like them to have 4 paragraphs, really minimum, okay, for this question. It depends on time. If you've got a bit more time, maybe squeeze another one in there. Excuse the cleaning noises in the background. So essentially with this question, first of all, I'm going to start off thinking about what my actual arguments are going to be. I'm not going to actually talk in this stage of my planning about specific examples or anything to do with this as rake structure. I'm actually just going to think about, first of all, what is my viewpoint and what could my individual sort of breakdown arguments be, because then I would be using the evidence of the production in order to sort of support my viewpoint on this. So I'm going to talk generally first and talk about whether or not set is something that is set to impress. Okay, and well, not just set, about technology. Okay, so for example, my first paragraph might be something like along the lines of actually there are several companies out there who don't have venues in which technology is accessible, aka very shoestring budgets, probably using a black box studio, for example, and that might formulate my first argument in the sense of actually there are productions that don't, and then talk about later the sort of how my production is. The production that I've currently taken my students to see was in the West End, so therefore technology particularly was a feature of this, so this is how they might talk about that. So in terms of talking about that as an argument and building in sort of that as rake structure, I might talk about set, not actually really tended to impress, if that was relevant to my viewpoint and the production. I would acknowledge the question and acknowledge that sort of standpoint that I have, i.e. it was meant to impress or it wasn't meant to impress, and then talk about actually how it was used, aka giving the analysis, and then I would talk about how it was, whether or not it was effective or not in terms of making that sort of production aims clearer, etc., and talk about whether it was meant to be successful, i.e. impressing the audience better, and so that brings you back to the question, wraps it back up nicely at the end. Okay, so that would be how I would sort of structure a planned paragraph. So this generally gives this idea of how I would cover that, and it kind of builds on this as rake structure as well. What this is missing, and what I would encourage you to do, it's just something I thought about after I'd set up my camera, was actually at this stage in your planning, I would also, first point do, as well as kind of think, right, what's my first argument, my second argument, my third argument, my fourth argument going to be, and then I'm going to start selecting the specific moments that I'm going to use to back this up. I would actually write down a little box, maybe here, somewhere like that, of key terms, as many key terms that are relevant to those examples that are going to come through. So that way, you kind of got a little tick list of things that you can use to kind of go, yeah, have I used enough terminology? It's keeping that in the forefront rather than it being just a description and analysis, etc. Okay, so that is an example of a question. I encourage you to, as an activity now, if you wanted to stop it and then do your own next paragraphs, and if you're my students, you can come in and see me and I can just kind of go, yep, you're on the right lines, or nope, you need to focus more on this. But keeping that as rake structure, but starting off with actually thinking about what side of the fence you are on, okay? And it doesn't matter about whether it's all positive or where it's all negative, or equally you might have a much more sophisticated and concise, using keywords there, response if you're actually kind of talking about the both and counter-arguing yourself, as long as you're doing that in a sophisticated way and developing that reasoning and that why and that because. Okay, now, if you haven't stopped, or equally if you're just coming back to this video, I'm going to take that away, okay, and I'm going to pop that there, okay, because that is an example of another question. We're not in the shot, there we go, okay. That's an example of another kind of question that, you know, might come up, okay. So just processing that. Theatre is more about the single performer nowadays. Okay, so that's a little bit informal in how I've written it, but it's a possible thing, it could come up. So, first of all, I'm going to think about what I want to focus on in terms of an argument. I know that I want to have a minimum of 4 paragraphs, so I'm going to do that there. I'm going to put my key terms box here. I know that I've got to do ASREIC. But before that, in order to acknowledge this question, I'm going to think of my first arguments within it, okay? So, I'll come out of shot, sorry, there we go. So, I'm going to just do one idea for a first paragraph, and then it is over to you guys in terms of how I would plan this out. So, theatre is more about the single performer nowadays. Well, that implies to me that, you know, it's more, either you're going to talk about the strength of the ensemble work in the production, or lack of, or you're going to talk about an individual. Perhaps you had maybe a celebrity in your production that you saw, or maybe there was one particular actor or a few particular actors that stood out, and that way you could argue the success of the lack of success of other actors within the ensemble, or perhaps you thought there were some weaker elements that brought this down. What this again doesn't sort of bring you into straight away and automatically is leading you to thinking about the designer. So actually you might be able to argue that there were design elements that it was more about. Maybe that took too much focus even away from the performers, or maybe perhaps it was a minimalistic performance in which the focus very much was supposed to be more on the actors portraying the intentions of the characters. So that's some sort of areas that you might want to think about. But first of all, don't think about the production, think about what your viewpoint might actually be. Okay, so I'm going to say, okay, for my first paragraph, if this was me, I might want to talk about actually in the production that we saw very recently, there was one particular actor portrayal of a character who actually portrayed quite a lot of infamy, and that was before we even got there. And then I would talk about whether or not actually that sort of hurt the production at all. So I'm trying not to give too much away because I don't know if I'm stepping on any sort of toes in terms of legally, so I won't go into the details of the production. However, my students know who that will be and which individual that would be because of the infamy of that character. But my first argument would be that actually there was an element, there is an element of that an individual character, an individual performance can indeed sort of talk about the success. So in some respects I am very much agreeing with that statement. Then I might counteract it. So my acknowledgement there, then I'd pick out the specific moments that I was referring to. I'm already starting to build in a range now because I'm talking about an actor, a specific actor, and how they use those skills and analyse those, bringing in those key terms. So key terms here, I'm probably going to be talking about elements that are to do with characterisation and how they built that character, and then talk about how successful that was within that. And then coming back to wrap myself back up, coming back to this question and therefore clarifying my viewpoint. So setting out our response first of all and then coming back to it, so almost a little mini conclusion. So I'm going to hand that over to you now and see where you take this. Again, if my students want to bring their responses in for that, that is absolutely cool. But best of luck. Hope that's been helpful. Thank you very much.